Today we'll hear from Paul's letter to the Romans about the gifts that we have in ministry and how to live in community together. We consider these words as we prepare to hear from someone who has been loved and nurtured by this community and gone out in the world to serve God. Hear what God's Spirit is saying to you. For as in one body we have many members, and not all members have the same function, so we who are many are one body. In Christ and individually we are members of one another. We have gifts that differ according to the grace given to us: prophecy in proportion to faith, ministry in ministering, the teacher in teaching, the exhorter in exhortation, the giver in generosity, the leader in diligence, the compassionate in cheerfulness. Let love be genuine, hate what is evil. Hold fast to what is good. Love one another with mutual affection. Outdo one another in showing honor. Do not lag in zeal. Be ardent in spirit. Serve the Lord. Rejoice in hope. Be patient in suffering. Persevere in prayer. Contribute to the needs of the saints. Extend hospitality to strangers. Bless those who persecute you. Bless and do not curse them. Rejoice with those who rejoice. Weep with those who weep. Live in harmony with one another. Do not be haughty, but associate with the lowly. Do not claim to be wiser than you are. Do not repay anyone evil for evil, but take thought for what is noble in the sight of all. If it is possible, so far as it depends upon you, live peaceably with all. Here ends the reading of words that give us insight on God. May God grant to us wisdom and courage for interpretation.
Holy words of our faith handed down to this age, they resound with God's own heart. Oh, let the ancient words impart, ancient words ever true, changing me and changing you. We have come with open hearts. Oh, let the ancient words impart.
Well, good morning, everyone, and thank you so much for being here this morning. You know, it's hard to find a silver lining in the midst of this pandemic and all the physical distancing, but one of the silver linings that I have discovered is that we are able to be with people who no longer are physically in San Diego. And that means that I am so pleased to welcome to UCC this morning the Reverend Larry Morris. Larry, we're so grateful to have you here with us. Some of you who don't know Larry may not know that he was a member of University Christian Church and then went off to seminary at Claremont School of Theology, and then worked at University Christian Church as our youth and family minister, and then was ordained out of UCC, which means he's a Timothy. That's the church word for being ordained out of a congregation. And then after he had finished our role as youth and family minister, he got suckered into going on a youth trip with me where he was rewarded for his generosity by getting his laptop and iPad stolen. So I think Larry has decided he's never going to go on the trip with me again. Larry, we're so grateful for you and your relationship with UCC, and so grateful that you are willing to have this conversation with me this morning. So everyone join me in welcoming Larry Morris. Larry, I thought maybe you could start by just introducing yourself and talk maybe initially about what brought you to University Christian Church.
Okay, well, it's good to be with you all again. I wish I could, someday be in person again. But I will go on another trip with you, Caleb. I'll put that out there.
That's fine if you're generous.
But I'll go on another trip. So I originally came to UCC because I moved from Indianapolis to San Diego. And I was on a church break for about 6 months. So I did not go to church at all when I moved. And I felt like God was like, it's time for you to go back to church, be in a faith community, right? Some intentional relationship. And so I did not know anyone in San Diego when I moved. So I asked some colleagues and some disciple friends if they knew of any disciples churches in San Diego. And UCC came up like 2 or 3 times in the, when people were mentioning congregations. So I knew that at that point in my kind of Christian walk, I wanted to be in a community that was intentional on celebrating diversity in all of its areas, around race, around sexual orientation, sexual identity, gender. And I remember at that time reading something, I think on the website or somewhere, that named all of the ways in which UCC leaned into diversity, leaned into inclusion. And so that was very important for me. So I came, went to visit. I think I visited 3 times before I joined. But even the first time, I felt the presence of God in this welcome, this community, and I didn't even visit another congregation. So when I came to UCC, that was kind of it for me.
So UCC, you hear that, how important it is to welcome people right away and to make them feel comfortable. And so I'm so glad that you came to UCC and didn't visit anyone else and stayed at University Christian Church. And so you stayed there and you started to discern kind of a call to seminary. How did that happen?
Yeah, so I felt called to ministry, even in Indianapolis. But I never wanted to go to seminary. Like I just did not want to go to seminary. I probably should unpack that more than another time, but this idea of like going to school for ministry I didn't want to do it. And so I remember even in Indianapolis, I went to Light of the World Christian Church, which is not far from Christian Theological Seminary. And Reverend Dr. Billy Bridges at Light of the World would always ask me when I was going to seminary. I was like, I'm not going to seminary, right? And so I kind of pushed that idea aside for as long as I could. And then once I moved to San Diego and I finished my undergrad, my bachelor's degree, I was praying and discerning like what I should do next. And I just felt this call to ministry again, right? And seminary in particular. Because in my mind, I was like, I could like have a job, don't go to seminary and still like pray for people and help people out. But as I was, singing songs like I Surrender All and things like that, I felt like God was leading me to the direction of seminary. And so I went to Claremont because I went to visit a friend in the Claremont area and connected with Disciple Seminary Foundation, Dr. Bynum in particular. And then I just felt like I was in seminary next, right? I felt like it was so like quickly after that. But yeah, I really went just because I felt like that was the thing for me to do. And even in the midst of discerning going to seminary, UCC was like in a transition, right? But I still supported. You all were still so supportive of my ministry and the letters that I needed to get into seminary, to sit down with me to make sure that I discerned the call, and I just, didn't want to go for the sake of going. And so I will say that even in the midst of transition with UCC, that there was still like this support and this still welcome. And so I am really grateful for that consistency.
Well, and I'm grateful because you're right. You can absolutely do the work of God without going to seminary. And you were in community organizing, right? You were doing great work. And but you are a gift to the church. And I'm grateful that you went to seminary and were ordained. And it was, what was it, almost 2 years ago that you were ordained?
Yes. Yep.
It seems like 10, but
what is time, right?
Yeah. But what have you been up to since ordination?
Yeah, so since ordination, I had planned to plant a church, and so I'm doing that. The name of the church is called Communion Christian Church, and it's in Henderson, Nevada. I'm doing the church plant with 2 colleagues and really good friends, Reverend Anita Michelle Cobb. I put her whole name online. Hopefully she won't get me. And then Dr. Tony Bond. And so like we are here discerning what God wants us to do and how we can participate in the work of God in Henderson and Las Vegas. And so what we say is that we cultivate disciples of Christ, we co-create community, and work towards collective liberation. And so, that is what we've been doing for the last year or so. Of course, like COVID has kind of impacted that, but in some ways it hasn't, because we really want to be intentional on building relationship, right? And relationships take time to build. And so really getting to know the community, getting to know each other in this different capacity of working together so closely in church. And so that's kind of one of the things I've been up to. I've also, I enrolled in the PhD program, which I know we'll talk about in a bit, but doing a PhD in African American preaching and sacred rhetoric at Christian Theological Seminary. So I did end up going to CTS after all. Then also doing some work around like digital marketing and communications work, some consulting there. I do a little bit of work around like anti-racism training and racial equity work. And then the last thing I'm kind of moving towards is becoming a spiritual director. So I'm finishing a spiritual direction practicum that in some ways focuses on people who are on the front lines of like either organizing or some movement work. Definitely open to all people, but really trying to create space for folks who, you know, put their lives on the line, right? Or who are on the front lines of whatever kind of movement work that may be, and may not always have spaces to kind of unpack that and to sit with what God, the Spirit may be doing in their lives. And so excited about moving more fully into that work.
Sounds like you're busy, Larry. That's a lot of things going on. And I'm sure everyone can support the work you're doing in part by following you on social media and in your church on social media and finding out what all is going on. And so one of the things that you mentioned was your PhD work. And I was hoping maybe you could tell us a little bit more about that, about what you're studying, about what that involves, about what you're reading right now, and what you've been learning.
Okay, excellent. I can. So the name of the program is African American Preaching and Sacred Rhetoric. It's under the direction of the Reverend Dr. Frank A. Thomas, who is one of my favorite people. And so it's the first PhD program in African American preaching in the country. And I had the pleasure of being a part of the second cohort. And so what we do is it's really focusing on practitioners and scholars, right? So preachers, African American preachers who are involved in preaching ministry or some form of sacred rhetoric, and also want to understand the Black preaching tradition and the Black sacred rhetoric tradition through like an academic lens. So we do PhD level research and an analysis on African American preaching and other sacred rhetoric. What I appreciate about the program is that it focuses and centers Black voices, right? African voices, African rhetoric, the experiences of African American people, and not in a way that isolates other communities, but in a way that allows us to really dig into our tradition, right? To really dig into the tradition of African American preaching and how it centers the Black voice, but it also has this liberation thread to it, right? This thread of liberation and equality, that can be critiqued, right? Everything can be critiqued, but really understanding that even the work that I'm called to do is a part of a tradition, right? It's not something that I just came up with, right? But I'm in some ways trying to discover and figure out the work that I'm called to do, whether it fits in this line of this liberatory kind of tradition, or whether it fits in with the work. One of the things that Dr. Thomas talks about, and I want to make sure I say this correctly, so I have to find the quote. But he says, the sheer genius of African-American preaching will ignite a preaching renaissance to revive American Christianity in the 21st century, right? So I think his goal is to figure out like what can we learn from African-American preaching that can help everyone else, right? These traditions of liberation and this rhetoric. How can we employ those words, those techniques in ways that benefit everyone? And so it's a great program. I'm a part of a cohort, which means there's 11 of us total who journey through the process together, which is not like other kind of PhD programs. I will admit I was not excited about that at first. As an introvert, I was like, I can do this by myself, right? It'd be good to see people every once in a while. But I am enjoying like the process of traveling through a program with the same kind of the same group of people, and really inspired by the work that my colleagues are doing, the ways in which we push and challenge each other academically, also theologically, and the ways in which we can support each other in the work. And so, yeah, that's a little bit about the program.
It's interesting, Larry. In my doctoral program. We were in a cohort as well, not a PhD program, but in my Doctor of Ministry program. But on our first visit to campus, it was the weekend that the incident in Charlottesville happened. Mm-hmm. And Dr. Thomas happened to be preaching at Duke Chapel that Sunday. And our whole cohort was there listening to Dr. Thomas. And throughout the rest of my program, his sermon was so powerful that it became something that every time we gathered, we spoke about. And so I would just attest to the power of the work that Dr. Thomas does, and the things that you are studying. And so I'm sure that it is great to be studying with him.
It is. So in a similar way, Dr. Thomas preached a sermon. I think I was a teenager, and the name of the sermon was "Try Easy" from Philippians 4. And that sermon has stayed with me, right? Those words that scripture and this idea of like really trusting God and leaning into the peace of God has stayed with me. It's traveled with me through transitions, physically, through job transitions, through my mother's transition, through her death. And so like to study with him or under him is like an academic dream come true, actually. So
yeah, it's powerful. Are you reading things that you would commend to others to be reading at the moment?
Oh, we read so much. I'm trying. So we're doing. I just finished a class on womanist preaching, and so like looking at like the ways in which Black women preach, and the techniques that they use and how they really they use their own lived experience, right, in the preaching moment and in life. And so I think most people may be familiar with like James Cone and Black liberation theology. But I am intrigued by womanist preaching because I think it centers, since it does center Black women, which is even in the Black preaching tradition, is a marginalized voice, right? And so for me, I think in the same way that I was attracted to UCC, I'm also attracted to like who is not heard. Like how do we share space and create space and listen to voices that are not always heard? And so I'm just really intrigued by womanist preaching and womanist theology at the moment. I can't think of a particular book right now, just because my brain is in 50 places. But like womanist preaching and womanist theology has really just captured me. Yeah.
When I was in seminary, I studied with Emily Towns, Dr. Towns, who we at least called the mother of womanist theology. And what a pleasure it was to be in her presence multiple times a week, but also to read the words that she wrote and the way that she called the church. And so, thank you for lifting that up. Larry, we're also living in a moment in our nation's history where people are rightly trying to think more about race. And, Larry, you are becoming an expert on sacred rhetoric in the Black church tradition. So based on what you have been learning and based on your own lived experience, what do white people in the church need to hear about how to love, support, and stand in solidarity with our Black and brown siblings?
Well, thank you for that question. And I think that is in many ways like a challenging question because in my own experience, but also when we look at just history, right? And we look at Black preaching, there's always been Black folks and people of color voicing their experiences and their pushback to like white supremacy or white dominance or racism. And so in some ways, I feel like the voices are already there, right? I don't know if there's a particular language that a particular way of voicing the concerns or the hurt. And so I think some of it is really just white people in the white church is really listening to the voices of Black people and brown people, right? Really hearing and acknowledging what folks are saying, right? And so I think about Sojourner Truth's Ain't I a Woman, right? So like, I think about Frederick Douglass's what is the 4th of July to the Negro? Like, so like, I think those voices have always been kind of around and out. My experience, even as someone who's done community organizing, and who has done like anti-racism work, is that I think sometimes after white people like hear the voices of Black and brown people, it's that risk of doing something, right? It's the risk of, yes, Black Lives Matter, but like, how do you put your body and your resources on the line to line up with what you say and what you confess? And so I think that is true for white people when it comes to being in solidarity with Black and brown folks. But I think this level of risk is true for any kind of justice work that we do, right? That after we listen to the experiences of people who are oppressed, how do we use what we have, whatever privilege we have, in service of those voices? And so in some ways, I feel like that is really, really broad. But I feel like that is like the thing, right? It's to really, once you hear, once you listen, once you're in relationship with the community, it's to do the things they're asking you to do. And sometimes that is not that's not for white people in the Black community, but I also believe that there's work that white people can do in their own communities, right? With their family members, right? And so even as an organizer, we would often have people, like white people in particular, who would want to come to communities of color to do the work, but did not want to do the same work of organizing in the white community, which is a different level of risk, right? And so for me, that's always the invitation. It's like after you hear, right, what Black folks and brown folks are saying, yes, to be in solidarity with us in our communities, but a part of that solidarity is taking the same risk in white communities, right, where there may be a different level of pushback. And so that is how we kind of offer an answer to that challenging question.
I really appreciate that answer, Larry, and to not to hold us accountable in the white community in the church to do what we say we care about. And I just am reminded of Dr. King's words that the most dangerous people are the white moderates who want to pretend like everything is fine. And I think that with a new administration, it would be easy to try and pretend like everything is just fine when we all know that it's not. And so I appreciate those words of challenge, and I appreciate those words of accountability for us. So, Larry, I want to be respectful of your time, and I want to be respectful of the time of everyone who is joining this morning. So, Larry, I want to say how deeply grateful I am for you and for the work you're doing, for the gift you are to the church. And I know that all those who are watching are applauding you and your work as well. So, thanks, Larry. Thanks for joining us this morning. We wish you well.
Thank you.